Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for making us feel welcome. This is a wonderful occasion to have Professor Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, who, of course, you all know something about, a distinguished colleague from MIT who is also a leading scholar in linguistics, and of course, probably there's no public intellectual in the world who has the stature of Noam Chomsky, and I feel very fortunate to have been a student of his decades ago. He probably doesn't remember that we used to take the T from here to hear you and Jerry Fodor teach in the 60s. And then I have known Bruno for a much lesser period of time, but a wonderful colleague, scholar, diplomat, science fiction writer or science editor? Science editor.
Sort of, yeah.
Worked for many years at OECD, got them interested in neuroscience, brain, study of language and culture, and for the last several years has been a visiting teacher here, both teaching courses and also here in J-term. And no matter how late I go home at night, and I go home pretty late, if I had to bet who's going to be sitting outside of Larson Hall chatting with students, it'll be Bruno. So it's great to have both of them here. We're trying to figure out the origin of this evening, and none of us was successful in doing it, but I think you all know that we're here. The catalyst for the evening was the publication, I guess in Portuguese, 45 years ago, of a book that had a lot of influence, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, by a man whose name I am not used to pronouncing, and I've taken lots of polls, and you'll hear it pronounced lots of ways tonight, but it's roughly speaking Paulo Freire. Thank you. And I want to start by asking the audience just to describe yourselves. How many people here know? The three choices will be know little or nothing about Freire, know enough so you could write a paragraph, the first paragraph of Wikipedia, and how many of you are really quite familiar with his writings, with critical theory, so this is for you, this is not an introduction, it's a coming home. So how many of you know little or nothing about it, so that would be an introduction? You're the only ones I'm not going to get called on, by the way. raise your hands higher, though. Okay, so it's about 14%. How many of you could write a paragraph? Okay, so I'm with most of you. We know something, but not a lot. And how many of you are really quite familiar with his work and writings? So it's a small number. So I think that's helpful for us to do. So we tend to go till around 7, and there'll be time for questions from the audience. I'm a very strict taskmaster when it comes to questions, so they can be a little bit more longer than a tweet. But you might actually, if you want to ask a question, you might want to write it down because that helps you to be succinct. We will begin by talking about how Noam and Bruno first encountered Freire's writings, whether they had some personal contact with him, what they thought at the time, how they've seen his influence wax and wane over the years. And I will then introduce Exhibit A, which I only discovered when I was boning up for this, which is an amazing 2 pages out of the Freire Reader about the Harvard Grad School of Education. How many of you know that on pages 4 and 5 of this book, the ed school gets excoriated? All right, well. Then we'll move into more general discussions of educational trends about which both of the people on the stage have observed over the decades, and where we are at this point in educational thinking and educational practice around the world. We may look a bit forward in both a dystopian and a utopian way about what might happen. And these are things, of course, that people who study your work here, talk and think about all the time, but we don't always have a chance to hear from people with the conspectus that Noam and Bruno have. We may talk a bit about other things, though we agreed that we're not going to discuss 9/11 or the most recent elections. This is for another day. Today is Freire's Day and education and the reasons for the current trends. So, are you guys okay with this?
Sure.
Okay. So, Noam, you actually mentioned when you first read the book. Can you talk a bit about your first contact with Freire's writings?
Well, he was actually here, though I didn't know it. It was when the English...
I don't know whether, is
is this working? Oh. Let me see.
It may be sort of working, but...
Let me see, maybe I've... Oh, it's green, it should be
Yeah,
working.
it is, okay.
Okay.
We're going to have to listen carefully.
It just doesn't like to be in my pocket. He actually was here at the time, though I didn't know it, when the English edition of his book came out, which was 1972. I read it. I already knew about his work. I hadn't read the Portuguese edition, but I was very much interested and involved, in fact, in the background out of which it grew. Remember, the original book came out in 1968, and rather interestingly, by the time it came out in English, 72, the situation had substantially changed over that 4-year period. 1968, as I'm sure you all know, was a pretty exciting year around much of the world, the United States as well, and in Latin America particularly, and in Brazil even more particularly. Actually, Freire had already been exiled from Brazil, so in fact his book couldn't appear there for years, many years. The dictatorship had repressed it. The dictatorship, incidentally, was strongly backed by the United States. It was apparently planned in the coup in the last days of the Kennedy administration took place right afterwards. And it was a vicious, brutal dictatorship, the first of a series of kind of neo-Nazi style national security states that spread through the hemisphere. It reached a horrible peak in the 1980s with the massive atrocities in Central America. This was the first major one. It was called the greatest victory for freedom in the 20th century by Lincoln, Gordon, Kennedy, Johnson, ambassador to Brazil, later college president. And that was typical of the reaction. It was very brutal. And one aspect of it was Freire's exile. And there was more than that. One of the leading figures in what was called liberation theology. It was the progressive part of the Catholic Church. Actually, it's called that, but the term is kind of strange. I would have thought it should be called the conservative part of the Catholic Church. And it was dedicated to bringing the Gospels back into Christianity. They had been kicked out of Christianity in the 4th century when the Roman Empire emperor took over the church and made it the religion of imperialism and oppression. First couple of centuries, Christians, not called Catholics then, were persecuted. The cross, which was the symbol of the suffering of the poor, was placed by the emperor on the shield of the Roman legions, early 4th century, and stayed pretty much like that. The great theologian and historian of Christianity, Hans Kung, describes this shift in the 4th century as the shift from the church of the persecuted to the church of the persecutors. And he himself describes in his history of Christianity Vatican II, which took place in 1962, and that's the background for Freire's work. He describes that as the moment when the church returned from the church of the persecutors to the church of the persecuted. It adopted tried
Is
to
persecuted the same word as oppressed? Or, because I'm wondering whether that's
just
part of...
basically the same.
Yeah.
Same as oppressed. And that's Freire's term. He's right in the middle of this. And Brazil was right in the center. The Brazilian bishops were the main force pressuring for the radical shift in the church that took place in 1962 under Pope John XXIII. And that initiated what came to be called liberation theology, which was dedicated to the gospel's principle of what's called preferential option for the poor. It had a lot of effects. The biggest effect, in fact, was in 1968 when Freire wrote. It was a bishops' conference of the Latin American bishops, which formally adopted the fundamental principles of liberation theology, preferential option for the poor. One of the leading figures was the bishop of Freire's native city, Recife, Dom Helder Camarões, called the Bishop of the Poor. They were doing things similar to, and sometimes borrowing from, the pedagogy of the oppressed that he developed. There were priests, nuns, lay people were going into the villages, out to the countryside, organizing what were called base communities, where people were reading the Gospels, not just reciting them, like you do on Sunday morning without thinking, but actually reading them, thinking about what they said. And as I said, it's radical pacifist. Trying to establish this concept of conscientization that Freire emphasizes. Raise consciousness, understand your own oppression, recognize that you don't have to be passive and oppressed. It's not all law of nature. Very similar things were happening here, I should say. I would say take the women's movement, which was just beginning to take off at that time. But it began exactly the same way, with small consciousness-raising groups, a group of women talking to each other and saying, repression, domination is not a law of nature. Things can be changed.
So let me ask you, you can say all of the above, but I'm wondering, here you are in 67, 68, it's the height of the Vietnam War. Your work in linguistics is becoming really well known, and it's the relationship to the rest of cognitive science. When you picked up this book, was it more because of political interest, more because of sort of just ideas? Did it have anything to do with the fact it was education? And did it have anything to do with the fact that he focused very much on language, reading and words and things like that? Do you have a sense of what drew you to it and what you took out of it?
Both, because one of the things I'd been working on in the 60s, and a couple of books came out, was the 17th and 18th century philosophy. And a lot of the ideas are kind of drawn from that. I don't know if he was conscious of it, but if you take a look at the Enlightenment conceptions of education, there were basically two competing conceptions. They were presented in imagery. One of the images was thinking of education as pouring water into a vessel. That's what Freire calls the banking model, and what a lot of you are familiar with. It's contemporary schooling in the United States, teaching to test, pour water into the vessel. As every one of us knows who's made it to college, it's a very leaky vessel. You can study for a test in some course you're not interested in and pass the test, and a week later you forgot what the course was about. That's our current educational system, more and more. And it has a purpose. I mean, we can talk about it, but and it sort of starts in the early 70s in the modern. It's part of the reaction against the liberating tendencies of the 60s that, say, the women's movement here was part of, the anti-war movement, Freire's the work in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the Median Bishops' Conference, which adopted the preferential option for the poor. All of this is integrated. I mean, in fact, even the literacy approach, he was much influenced by the highly successful literacy program in Cuba in 1961, which had similar conceptions. The principle was the teachers, the literacy teachers, should go out to teach, but also to learn.
It's very Freirean as well.
That's
flattening the.
And you should break down the relation of kind of domination between teacher and student, where the teacher essentially is pouring water into the vessel.
So remind me, because later I want to ask both of you why, after at least 3 centuries internationally and at least a century here of such an articulate critique of this view, why it remains so dominant. But we're going to come back to that later.
Yeah.
Let's ask Bruno. Now you weren't quite as much on the scene in the 60s as some of the rest of us.
No.
Tell us a bit about what you were doing when you first encountered Freire's work, and what's your stance toward it? What attracted you? What did you get out of it?
Well, yeah, thank you, Howard. In fact, yes, I was 6 years old when this book was published, so I could read already, more or less, but that was it. Interestingly enough, the very first time I heard the name of Freire was after most of my education, including at university level and being a linguist and a social linguist and educator. I had never heard his name until I reached Mexico, where I spent a few years of my life and taught social linguistics there. And I had started to develop a way of teaching which I thought was, well, adapted for me and hopefully good for the people in the audience. And one of the participants came after one class and said, "You know what, you've read too much of Freire." And that was the very first time in my life I heard his name. So I was like, sorry, but of course, I didn't want to appear as the guy who obviously doesn't know anything about someone who everyone is supposed to know. So I said, oh, no, I haven't read that much. What was the name again? And in fact, so I was attracted, my attention was attracted this way, but I didn't back then take the time to really look for anything or etc. I came across Freire in a second way a few years later. And exactly as Noam has said, through my interest for liberation theology. I read people like Leonardo Boff and Gustavo Gutierrez, and of course Donel de Camara, and I came across the name again. I thought, well, okay, one of my students in Mexico told me that I've read too much of Freire, and now I find the name of this guy again in the books of these liberation theologians. What is that? And then I read this book for the first time. So that took a while. But interestingly enough, during all my years, or maybe I didn't pay attention, maybe I was asleep, maybe it was not part of the test that I had to learn by heart, or whatever, but I don't remember having heard the name of Freire. I heard probably 10 million times the name of Piaget, but I never heard the name of Freire. And after a while, I wondered why. And I think now I have some hypothesis on that. Why is Freire not that well known, even if his work is, in my view, more relevant than it ever was. It was, of course, relevant when he wrote this at the end of the 60s, published 68. But in the world we live in today, and I would say especially in this country or in the Western world, it is more relevant than ever.
Well, spell that out for us.
Well, pedagogy of the oppressed. Since we have someone who has been busy with linguistics with us, I'm tempted to just, take the title like this and say, well, okay, pedagogy. Why pedagogy and not didactics? After all, he was more involved in adult education, etc. So it's not necessarily about children, but of, not for. This is crucial. And oppressed, the oppressed. Why? What does Freire in this book understand under the expression the oppressed? As far as I see, and I read it again, of course, before coming here, a couple of times. I had a lot of time to read in the last month. I read it and I thought, well, okay, he is writing at the end of the 60s in the context that you reminded us of, Howard, and is, of course, extremely involved in Latin America, Brazil to begin with, and then Chile when he's in exile. Fine. So what he describes are oppressed people in the sense of poor people, the preferential option for the poor that Noam mentioned. That's an expression of Gustavo Gutierrez, actually published after this book, but taken by the Bishops' Conference in Medellin, and even more in Puebla, 1979. The poor, which kind of poor are we talking about? And does the definition of the oppressed that Freire gave 45 years ago still match with the definition of the oppressed today? My very short answer to this one, to begin with, and we'll come back to this later on, is to say the following. Of course it does. The structure is still exactly the same, only it has become even more efficient in terms of oppression than it was probably back then. However, what might have changed, and that's at a superficial level, is exactly who are the oppressed. Freire in this book doesn't speak too much about the middle class. I know that you don't use it here in the US the way we use it in Europe, the expression middle class. But actually, in the context he's writing in, the middle class is maybe not that relevant for his purpose. So he's talking about an elite, the oppressors, and a wide majority of people who have basically nothing, and that is the oppressed. Now, if you look at our Western societies today, almost everybody I see around me is oppressed in a way or another. But at the same time, we are also oppressors. We are oppressed by not only the oppressors above us, but by the invisible hand that we all know about. And because of that, we almost have no choice but to oppress people who are around us or whatever. And I think that we can read again Paulo Freire's work today in this sense without taking anything from his fabulous vision. He was a visionary, definitely, a prophet in the true sense of the word, the one who announces and denounces and etc. My sense is that it is very easy for the neoliberals today, who are dominant all over the place, as you know, to say, this is old-fashioned, this is superseded, this is overtaken, we can forget all this was good for the 60s.
Let's hear Noam react to this. As Bruno's speaking, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm thinking of what happened since the 60s. And it was already beginning in the 60s, in the early 60s. If you go back to Vatican II, it was heresy. The idea that you should pay attention to the Gospels is absolute heresy. There's a nice literary exposition of it in Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor. If you're familiar with that, it sort of captures it almost exactly. But the idea that, you probably know the story, but the Gospels is just too revolutionary and too radical, if you really think about it. And when this became taken over by the Latin American bishops, in fact, a lot of it under their influence, particularly in Brazil, there was an immediate reaction to stamp it out, a dual reaction. Part of the reaction came from the Vatican. That was the soft side. That was shutting people up, like putting them under a ban. The chief enforcer for this was Ratzinger, became Pope Benedict later, but it started right away, almost after John Paul XXIII died, it started. big reaction, shut them up.
But just historically, we do have 20 years of John Paul between the
And
death,
yes,
the
and he
death
was,
of 23rd.
he was one of the leading figures in shutting them up. Yeah, he's very much respected because he was in favor, he was opposed to communism in Eastern Europe and so on. But what he did in Latin America is quite different. That's a long story.
So the irony is, I mean, I think he was genuinely beloved there, so you might say...
In Latin America?
Yes,
No, it's a much more mixed story than that. I can talk about it if you like. But, yeah.
There's an interesting quote by Helder Camara about that, which I think captures the whole debate around the liberation theology. He said something like, when I give something to eat to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor and why they have nothing to eat, they call me a communist.
Yeah, that's good.
And I think Helder Camara with that captured the whole thing.
And he himself was silenced in 1970.
Right.
This is right in this interim period between the Portuguese and the English edition. So that was the soft side. The harsh side was coming from us. The United States went to war against the church, fought a brutal, violent war against the church. Ever since the early 60s, the Brazilian coup, which we backed and supported, was the first major step, and it went right on through the murder of the Archbishop in El Salvador, Archbishop Romero, who was called the voice for the voiceless. He was actually a conservative archbishop who was appalled by what was happening to his priests. They were getting murdered because they were trying to do things like pursue the pedagogy of the oppressed, the liberation of the poor, you know. And he himself changed. He was a very honorable person, assassinated. It kind of ended, not totally, but it came to a sort of symbolic end, if you like, right at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, when an elite Salvadoran battalion trained and armed by the United States, which already had killed, nobody knows how many thousands or tens of thousands of the usual victims, peasants, working people, human rights activists, priests and others, they had just come back from renewed training, upgrading their skills at the John F. Kennedy School of Counterinsurgency in North Carolina. They came back to El Salvador, and under the direct orders of the high command, they were ordered to enter the university to murder 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals, Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, and also anyone else who was there, so there'd be no witnesses. So they murdered their housekeeper and her daughter. This is under the direct orders of the high command, close connection to the American embassy. I doubt if there's anybody here who can even mention their names. If you mention dissidents in Eastern Europe, everybody can mention their names. They were treated badly, but nothing like what happened in Latin America during the same years. And, but they're our victims, so therefore we don't know about them. But through this period, there was, as I said, a really vicious war against the church. And the heresy was pretty much stamped out, not totally, you know. Residues remain, still alive, but suffered a severe attack, and that's what comes to mind when I talk about this. And the same things happen with the educational system. In my opinion, at least, the kind of imposition of rigidity and conformism, the banking model, you know, the fill the vessel model.
It's the banking model actually has the banking model has a double meaning now, since we're living in such a highly banked
Freire's sense, you know, pour water into the vessel.
Yeah. But let's
that's since the night. That starts around the time of the same repression in Latin America.
Let's come back to that in a couple of minutes. But I don't want to leave Freire's pedagogy unexplored. So I want to ask you a question, but it's also for the audience. Have any of you actually spent real time either watching the work that he did with adults, peasants in Latin America, or analogous work in North America? Or are we talking about something like, John Dewey's school, which was only open for a few years, had a lot of influence, but not because there were many people who had actually been there and seen there?
I did. I was one of them.
But I'm asking about Freire now, not John Dewey.
Yeah.
But did either of you actually ever see, the kind of very equal drawing out, giving agency to the impoverished that he writes about, or is it something you just know from his written?
Anyone who's spent any time in poor areas in Latin America, but in fact other parts of the world, sees things like this happening.
But I'm asking, this is not a tribunal, but I'm actually interested whether you actually saw the Freire methods at work yourselves. Yeah?
Yeah, I did to some extent, especially in Latin America, because as I said before, in North America and in Europe, the name Freire is hardly known except by experts, and not even by experts maybe from time to time. But in Latin America, there are institutions which are generally not mainstream, by the way, or they cannot be mainstream, which are linked to the church or to this particular movement within the church, liberation theology, or coming from a more Marxist kind of framework, which is dedicated to what is called educación popular. And in some institutions I have seen, including at university level, people take this very seriously. And my sense is that, consciously or not, they are extremely influenced by Freire. I say consciously or not because, again, sometimes it's always the same thing. When this student told me, that I had read too much of Freire, and I said, sorry, I don't even know the name of that guy, I'm not suggesting that I had reinvented everything myself. Of course not. I had certainly been influenced through other channels and consciously by people who themselves had been influenced by Freire and etc. This is always the problem. How are you sure that one idea of yours is original? You can never be completely sure. Now, the point is that, sorry, Howard, but in some universities, and I remember that very well in Mexico, particularly, I've seen that in Peru as well, and in some other countries, in Nicaragua, that's quite obvious. Ernesto Cardenal, you may have met with him, was a Jesuit who was a liberation theologian.
Partially attacked by Pope John.
Right, exactly. He became Minister for Education, and then he was sort of sacked by the church.
Pope, yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. And in a very humiliating way on top of that. Now, the fact of the matter is that there are people, especially in Latin America, who really believe in the virtue of this, say, pedagogy of the oppressed, and try to implement it. But they face a lot of resistance and inertia from above, if I may say so, that's quite obvious, but also from the people they are addressing. It's fear of freedom, it's anything you want, Freire describes that very well, that it is not that easy to go and tell people, think by yourself, think for yourself. It is very dangerous, and most people would resist it, even violently.
If I can add something to that, remember that Freire was not just teaching literacy. In fact,
right.
If you look at his pedagogy of the oppressed, it's consciousness raising. That's the point. Literacy is an instrument for it. And consciousness raising leads to, should, he thinks, and says straight out, lead to a radical and revolutionary change. A change in the institutions when people understand. Actually, this goes back to the history. I mean, I've seen it all over the place, not just in poor communities in Southern Colombia, Latin America, but elsewhere in the world. So take India. I don't know how many of you know anything about India, but there's one relatively poor state in India, Kerala, which has an extremely high level of literacy, and also specifically, and education generally, and incidentally of women's education. And that's the reason why fertility goes straight down. It's been a consequence of women's education that you get, and sort of women's control of what they can do, that literacy, that fertility goes way down. It's a very poor place. And if you visit it, you see it. it's the one part of India where you can kind of drive around and see people sitting at a little bar or something, sitting outside reading newspapers, talking to each other and so on. Also, the other place I saw it in India is in West Bengal, in the what they call panchayat, the cooperative villages, which sprang up in the course of a revolution. It was they killed the landlords, drove him out, took over the region, and it's pretty, I could talk about it, but it's pretty amazing when you see it. And what you see is, one of them when I went in with a friend, an agricultural economist, that happened to be a village council meeting going on. These are very poor villages, and there was an officer, an Indian government officer in the background. Years before, he would have been running the meeting, telling everyone what to do. This time he was kind of in the background. Occasionally they'd turn to him and ask for some information or something, but it had nothing to do with anything. The village council was local people talking very informed, eloquent ways. One of them was actually a tribal woman. That's about the lowest of the low in the Indian awful caste system. But she was one of the council members, talked to others, telling people her opinion and so on. This is all the result of years of conscientization in Freire's sense, not just literacy, but learning who you are, what your rights are, why you can overcome oppression, taking control of your lives. And that's what the heresy was in Latin America. People priests, others going into the poor areas and trying to bring this about, sometimes borrowing Freire's methods. And remember that it's much broader because Cuba had done something like it a couple of years earlier, which he knew very well and talked about. And that's why they had to be crushed. That's why, again, if you read the Grand Inquisitor, it says it very precisely.
Now,
in this case, the United States was the Grand Inquisitor.
At the risk of being a little bit pedantic, I want to draw out something which was stated by Bruno, and that is thinkers can have a lot of influence on what we think and do, even if we don't know about them. And I think that probably there are people here who knew nothing about Freire, but whose ideas came to some extent because of the diffusion. Also, it was in reading about him that I realized that he was also the part of a wide-ranging intellectual tradition, as well as somebody who, not entirely through his own desire, was in Chile and was here in Cambridge and so on. And that is, he was very much influenced by the French existentialists and the notion of consciousness, Sartre and Husserl, and that phenomenology, that school, but also, interestingly, by people who were looking at psychoanalytic ideas like Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse. Mm-hmm. And so here's a guy who, on the one hand, is writing very practically about what you should be doing if you want to raise consciousness and get people to have a sense of agency, but he's also involved in a web of middle 20th century intellectual influences, whether they go back to the 17th and 18th century, probably at least implicitly they do. I want to ask, though, if there's anybody in the audience who actually has an anecdote based on his or her own observation of Freirian ideas, even better if they were explicitly called that, because in India probably people didn't know that terminology, and who knows where it arose.
Because it comes spontaneously from the situation and circumstances.
Okay, well, why don't we take this gentleman here?
Yes, thank you. So, my name is Miguel Rey, and I studied in Bogota in the 70s in a private university, and I'm going to say half of my university became very leftist because of Freire's ideas, and Freire was really, truly very influential. And actually, the term mamerto was was used at the time. All these leftist friends of mine and their ideas that were very, conscientización, Today are very wealthy people doing very well. That was a private university like this university here, Universidad de los Andes, very expensive. And the term emeritus is those who love to be this way but end up being this other way. And the sadness is that one thing was the dream or the desire to change things, and it never happened.
Thank you. I think that's something we're going to come back to at the end when we talk about utopia and dystopia. And we've all been around long enough to have been swung in different directions. Is there anybody else? One other person? Yeah, please. This is not a setup.
Hi, my name is Karina. In Mexico, in my experience in Chiapas, spending time in Zapatista communities, the school system there, the autonomous school system, is set up based on the principles of Freire. Whether or not it's explicit or otherwise, the school does run under consciousness-raising framework where students are taught about what it means to be themselves, whether they be Chol or Tojolobal or whatever ethnicity, as well as citizenry within the Mexican nation state and how neoliberalism works in their lives and in their communities. So that I've seen that in action in very small communities in Chiapas, Mexico.
Thank you. So as I was doing my homework, I have to admit that I was shocked when I picked up the Paulo Freire reader and discovered that as early as page 4 of the introduction, the whipping boy was the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And so I want to read a few quotations. I mean, Nome was here at the time, and his wife was teaching. So they may have some context, and it's possible somebody else in the audience as well. So it begins by describing a professor who is not named commenting on a graduate student's paper. And the comment is critical, especially mentioning, quote unquote, Freire and Giraud. Giraud was probably the leading student of, student acolyte would be a better word. How else can one explain a culture that pontificates about intellectual rigor and yet allows a graduate course titled Politics of Literacy to be taught without any reference to Freire? Continuing, in fact, if one applies rigorous standards of the academy, we soon realize that most of the professors at HGSE, that's what's the words here, are not among the most cited educators in the United States. Their work has done little to advance theoretical debate. They have contributed few earth-shaking ideas that might help to raise schools. It's no wonder that after a lecture was given about Paulo Freire at the School of Education, this is Bruno here. I don't want to sound naive, but who is this Paulo Freire? The professor is citing a lot. And then this is where it gets angry. How can one expect this doctoral student to know of the work of the most significant educator in the world during the last half-century when the Harvard Graduate School of Education sanctions a graduate course called Literacy, Politics, and Policy without requiring students to read, critique, and analyze the work of Freire? And then I had to chuckle at this last comment here. What can expect from a culture in which a professor responded to Freire's death, which was 1997, in the following manner? Freire's coming to Harvard would have made 20 students very happy while making the rest of the students extremely unhappy. Then the person does say, now he's dead and we're all unhappy, but that may be a personal statement. So can you help us understand why this reader begins with this? Is Harvard a metonym here, or do you know whether there were things that were going on here?
It's Donaldo Macedo. It's Donaldo Macedo.
Whom I don't know, but
he doesn't love Harvard for a lot of reasons. But
give us a a little context, because I was kind of shocked to see this.
It's not the School of Education, it's the entire university.
Okay, so it's metonymic then.
The entire university is like that. I mean, there are things as a student you just don't learn and aren't taught. So take today, for example, May 1st. I mean, this morning, one of the first...
A coincidence, right?
One of the first emails I got this morning was from a friend in Brazil, and she wrote me that she's not going to go to work today. It's a holiday. What are they celebrating? It's a day of... I don't know how many of you know this, but it's a day of it's a day of supporting the struggle of American workers for an 8-hour day. That's May Day everywhere in the world except the United States.
And the UK. And the UK.
And UK
Yeah.
also, yeah. That's
But
it's our
a state.
colony.
Yeah, but you're right. It's
Yeah,
the
so they
51st
don't-
state. Yeah.
But here's a day commemorating the whole world practically as supporting highly oppressed American workers, some of the most oppressed in the industrial world, in 1886, it's not modern. And in the United States, nobody ever heard of it. In fact, Ronald Reagan, one of the most extreme anti-labor presidents, turned it into Law Day, a day of celebrating our dedication to law. Actually, we have a Labor Day, but think when it is. Our Labor Day is when people go back to work. That's Labor Day, not the day in which they struggle for their rights, for an 8-hour day. Well, just pick that because it happens to be today. But the number of things we don't learn is amazing. Like, for example, how many of you learned about the U.S. war against the church through the 60s, from the 60s through the 80s? I mean, nobody learns that. How many of you even heard of the names of the murdered Jesuits? Actually, I give you an illustration of what, on the 25th anniversary of Archbishop Romero's death, there was actually a commemoration in Boston, but it wasn't in Harvard Square. It was in Jamaica Plain, in a poor church, poor immigrant church. Yes, there they had a commemoration of Romero's death. One of the speakers was a woman, Miriam Manaya, who had been a Salvadoran judge. Her husband was also a human rights activist, murdered by U.S. trained forces in El Salvador, who were carrying out huge massacres. But it's in Jamaica Plain. On the 30th anniversary of the assassination of the Jesuits, which is a pretty serious event. I mean, if that had happened in Czechoslovakia, we'd probably have had a nuclear war, But here, 30th anniversary, there was a commemoration. It was in Boston College, Jesuit College, and it was quite well done. The president, who's pretty conservative, was there. One of the speakers was Father Jan Sobrino. He's the one surviving Jesuit from the university. He didn't happen to be there when the assassination team came. So he spoke, and he gave a very moving speech in which he said, look, we shouldn't be mourning the Jesuit intellectuals who were killed, but rather their housekeeper and daughter. They're the ones we should be focusing on, the ones who were killed, so there wouldn't be any witnesses, because they represent the people of El Salvador, the real victims, not just the famous intellectuals. Anybody know anything about this? I mean, these are things that ought to be taught in grade school, and you can go on and on. And the reason why Freire was unknown is because he was not just talking about literacy. If he'd been saying, here's a nice method for teaching literacy to adults, that would have been fine. But it went way beyond that. It was literacy as a means for consciousness raising, for raising questions about your position among the oppressed and why you should accept that and why you shouldn't, what the society is like and how it should be changed. By U.S. standards, he was a radical revolutionary. Of course he's unknown.
Let me ask, and this is only if somebody actually has any additional comments, because they were around at this time, there will be a chance to speak up. I may be around, but I have to admit, I was one of these people who knew Piaget and not Freire, though I was aware of him, but no different than I was aware of Montessori or of Steiner. These were names, and you picked up things. Right. But certainly I was aware of other intellectual traditions dealing with Latin America, Catholicism, radicalism. I don't think there was any conspiracy not to teach him here, but I think it's interesting that Machado does use it metonymically. But is there anybody here who could provide any additional context on this, or should we put it aside? Okay, we'll take. You don't look like you could have been there, but we'll assume that you're a historian.
Hi, my name is Swati, and I'm also from India. It was interesting for me when I came to the Graduate School of Education that I saw an absolute absence of Freire's name anywhere. And for all of the courses that I took, I didn't ever read Freire, and I did a bachelor's and master's in elementary education in India, and the entire book was prescribed. So I'd read Freire through 6 years of my education in India. When I came to the ed school here, there was no thought around Freire's work. And I also thought that I don't think it's a random sort of incident. I also feel that it's part of the larger way in which curriculum is framed in this university, where there's no space for Marxist thought itself. In the Department of Economics, there is maybe one professor which teaches a course in Marxism. At the ed school, when we talk about the politics of education, we don't ever discuss what does it mean to, what was Gandhi's notion of education, what was Freire's notion of education, what was, some of these other thinkers which think differently than this larger neoliberal regime of standardized education thought about education. I just absolutely see an absence of that debate and discourse in America. So I see this as a consequence of sort of that framework rather than a random incident. That's all I want to say.
That's a very, very valuable contribution. Thank you.
I guess,
and I think we all should feel a little bit bad that that in India this was not a foreign infecting agent. I mean, I'm not going to give an exposition on the school, but I think that we could do well to be much more alert to intellectual currents, including ones that might make us uncomfortable. You want to?
no, just one quick
You
comment
teach here,
about
after all. Nobody tells you what to teach. So.
True. I have to think about that, and I will. No, but actually, just when you read this page, Howard, I was wondering something in the same direction. What would Freire or the people who have edited this book, his widow and Donaldo Macedo, say today about Huxley? Not how it was 40 years ago. I mean, I wasn't there. You may know, but what would they say today? Is the banking system of education alive even in this very institution? And if yes, how? And is this really, can we learn something from Freire? And I'm not only talking about Huxley, obviously, but about our universities in general and how we train and, teachers and people who are going to be responsible for the future of mankind, because this is it, actually. Now, regarding, in this country, as far as I understand, the word communist is one of the worst possible insults you can imagine. Now, if you have someone who quotes on a regular basis in a small book like that, Karl Marx and Mao Zedong and Herbert Marcuse and Georg Lukács, not George Lukács, Georg Lukács, right? And Franz Fanon and people like that, and even Che Guevara. I mean, it's alone per se. Even if you just look at the references, it is probably enough for quite a lot of people in our societies to just discard it and say, this is dangerous stuff, you know?
But you know, I'm going to interrupt here for a second, because I think the notion would not be that it's dangerous. The notion would be that it's irrelevant. Okay. And that's equally damning, but it's a very different...
Precisely. Yeah. I wanted to come to that, because there is something in my view. I said, well, Freire refers directly to Che Guevara and to Gustavo Gutierrez, who, by the way, were born in the same year, 1928, which was a very good year for thinkers. Am I right, no? Yes! I noticed that you were just exactly as old as Che Guevara and Gustavo Gutierrez.
So it's all in the stars, right?
It's all the stars, exactly. So fortunately, we still have Nome and Gustavo with us. Now, the point is this, and that's exactly what you're pointing at, Howard. It is not about, we don't want to hear about that because it's dangerous. It's Marx or it's Darwin or whatever you want to diabolize in a way or another. in this country or in other Western countries. It is something like a very sharp discourse that has developed to my knowledge, or for what I've seen, dramatically over the last 10 years, is to dismiss ideas like that as irrelevant, old-fashioned, superseded, you name it. Most of you, or some of you at least, know where I come from and in which institution I was working at, etc.
We'll talk a bit about that, because
Well, yeah.
that's what I wanted to segue in, and then we'll open it up.
Precisely. I spent, I'm almost embarrassed to confess it right now, but I spent 14 years of my life at the OECD in the Directorate for Education.
Explain what OECD is.
Yes. Organization for Economic, not Education, Economic Cooperation and Development. Among other things, the Directorate for Education has produced a few flagships that are extremely well known, such as PISA, for instance, and stuff like that. Well, PISA is certainly a very interesting study. However, some of us, a minority, a small minority, had a critical stance from the beginning and say, well, look, PISA is interesting. It's certainly one of the most powerful comparative tool that has been developed so far in terms of, comparing performances of 15-year-olds here and there. However, it's statistics, for God's sake, and it's only statistics. You have statistics, what does it tell you? Nothing. You remain at the surface of the whole thing. And then the discussion started, but it was crushed very quickly. Say, oh, you guys are old-fashioned. You are like, 68ers. Or it said, look at your hair. You're completely superseded. No, exactly that sort of things. And then I said, well, look, I wonder, actually, if it's not too easy to take, for instance, in a book like that, or in what we've done, examples that are actually, yes, maybe a bit out of date, to completely dismiss very powerful ideas that go back well beyond 68 to the Gospels or to other writing of wisdom that we have in all great philosophical systems. Just one thing. Quantophrenia, this tendency of...
Quantophrenia.
Quantophrenia.
You heard it first here.
Yeah, right. Some here are familiar with that, I'm sure. It's this tendency of the social sciences to want to put everything in numbers in order to look serious, like the natural sciences. But in fact, it is in the first place to look serious, but at the very end of the day, it is much worse than that. It is a way to not go deeper into the explanation. Again, it is one thing to say so many people are living under this standard of poverty. Once you have said that, you're still not asking, why are these people living under this standard? And when you say, for instance, in this country or in that country, in studies like PISA, for instance, so many children succeed, so many children do not succeed, and etc., fine. Now let's talk. Why is that? We can go further, we can go deeper. PISA provides the tools for that, but as soon as you start to discuss it, and when you say, well, look at the socio-economic and socio-cultural background of these kids who are failing at school, then you are called a communist or something like that. And this is very related to this, You mentioned Sartre and Beauvoir and so forth. I mean, these guys were highly respected in Europe, especially in France. It's not every day that in France we have great thinkers. So... We had Descartes and Beauvoir and now we have, Now anyway, but these people were highly respected in the 60s. I'm not sure that Freire came directly in contact with Sartre, but through Franz Fanon, he certainly did. Today, these people are dismissed as totally out of date.
I think, just without passing any judgment on it, I think that the fall of communism, as symbolized by the wall falling, gave many people license, we won't even evaluate it, to dismiss pre-89 discourse. I want to ask Nome a question which may make him even more philosophical than he usually is. But Nome mentioned something very interesting that we were talking about when you're sick, what do you do? And the answer is you read. And you mentioned that you had read Hegel because you had to go to the hospital, and what else are you going to do in the hospital? You said if you weren't going to read Hegel now, you're never going to read him. So I was there. I was there in the late 60s, but not at all central than the way you were. But looking at the last 40 years, could you have anticipated what we call among ourselves the neoliberal trend? And to what extent is it Hegelian in the sense of synthesis, of thesis and so on? Or are there more accidental things that,
Well, I should say that...
Nixon hadn't come, or Reagan hadn't come, or Thatcher?
Yeah, I think it was already beginning.
Okay, so
it was already beginning.
Yeah, tell us. Yeah.
First of all, I read Hegel because I thought it was quite funny. I thought it was some of the craziest, stupidest things I'd ever seen. And I've actually written about it a little. Some of it is totally outlandish. But in the...
But I'm talking about the pendulum when I talk about Hegel. Yeah.
Well, by the early 70s, there was already a very striking backlash, very visible, quite public, against the liberating, democratizing tendencies of the 1960s. They're right here at Harvard, in fact. It was very clear. So, for example, one famous Harvard professor, Samuel Huntington, a professor of science of government at Harvard, he was the author of, he was the American rapporteur in a conference which was published of what's called the Trilateral Commission. It's called The Crisis of Democracy. You should read it if you haven't yet. It's very interesting. I think came out about 74 or 75. The Trilateral Commission represents the liberal fringe of American politics. So it's basically the Carter administration. In fact, the Carter administration came almost completely from their ranks. It's not the right wing. So what's the crisis of democracy? This is mostly Huntington, but also representatives from France and Japan who basically said the same things. Crisis of democracy was that in the 60s, there was too much democracy. And that puts all sorts of groups that are usually passive and acquiescent, and what are sometimes called special interests, began to enter the political arena to press for their own demands. Their consciousness was raised. Women, young people, old people, working people, farmers, all special interests, population in other words, their special interests, and they were trying to enter the political arena, press for their demands. It's interesting that in this entire discussion, one group is not mentioned, the corporate sector, the business world. And there's a reason for that. They're not a special interest. They're the national interest. That's tacitly understood. Cool, but it's sort of, you're made to understand it. That's part of being oppressed. So they're not mentioned. But the special interests have to be subdued. We have to have what Huntington called more moderation in democracy. They have to go back to passivity and acquiescence. And they didn't miss the schools. He talked about what he called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. Okay, that's where you are. They're responsible for the indoctrination of the young, the schools, the universities, the churches. And the point was they're not doing their job. They're not indoctrinating the young properly. And you can see it by all these, women asking for rights, people demonstrating against the war. These people are supposed to be indoctrinated. They're supposed to be passive, obedient, acquiescent. They're not supposed to have their consciousness raised. That's the early 70s. Incidentally, that's the liberal aspect of it. At the very same time, I won't go into it, but I urge you to read a pretty famous memorandum called the Powell Memorandum. It was Powell, who later became a Supreme Court justice under Nixon. He was actually a lobbyist for the tobacco industry, but a very influential right-wing figure. He wrote a memorandum which was supposedly confidential, supposed to be confidential. It was sent to the American Chamber of Commerce, the main business group. It leaked, and people could read it if they want. It's worth reading. That's the harsh end. What he says basically is, look, the business classes in the United States are the most oppressed group in the country. Everybody else is getting everything, and we're getting nothing. The radicals like Herbert Marcuse and Ralph Nader and others are just destroying the whole society. And they've got to be, and the universities are totally out of hand. They're all Marxist crazies running around, and we, the business classes, are utterly oppressed. But then he says, look, we have the money. We control the legislatures. We control the trustees. We're the owners of the media. We don't have to let these radicals take over everything. And you have to read it to see the rhetoric. That's what it's like. So therefore, we should use our power as our control of wealth to beat back this attack on the essentials of civilization, which is going on. That's the right-wing variant of Samuel Huntington and the Trilateral Commission's liberal variant. But both agree you've got to, the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young have to meet their responsibilities. And we have to change them so they do that. That's the early 70s.
When you become Hegelian for a moment.
Hold on 1 second. Let me say that for those of you who know the history of American education, nothing new about this. It goes back to the origins of the mass education system. That was a great contribution in the United States, mass public education. But it had some qualifications. A large part of it was an effort to turn independent farmers into obedient, passive factory workers. And you had to educate them for that. And it was recognized. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, pointed out that he said he hears lots of influential people calling for a mass education. And when he asked them why, they explained that, look, there are millions of people getting the right to vote, and we have to educate them to keep them from our throats. Because if they're not properly indoctrinated, they're going to understand what's going on in the world, and they'll go after our throats. And here I would slightly disagree with the distinction between dangerous and irrelevant. I think they're the same thing. These things are irrelevant because they're dangerous. If people think about them, they're going to go after the throats, symbolically, of those with power. They'll ask for their rights too, and that's just much too dangerous. So, and this is a current that, runs through. It's related to the fact that nobody knows what May Day is in the United States, as distinct from everywhere else. All of this is part of a system of indoctrination, which, in Freire's terms, provides the culture of submission. In fact, what he called the culture of freedom from fear. He took it over from escape from freedom. And people have to, and the idea of the consciousness-raising programs, of which the literacy program was a part, was to overcome this on the part of people. Well, we start getting the reaction in the early 70s, and it goes on, and it takes various forms, and it now reaches forms that have names, like No Child Left Behind, or Race to the Top, which means every child left behind and race to the bottom. And that's, and anybody who's a teacher knows this.
I do want to open it up to the audience, but I'm going to be insistent on knowing whether you think the 60s were an anomalous blip. You don't?
No, the 30s were similar. The 1890s were similar. Look, in the latter part of the 19th century, if anybody studies it, the most powerful and impressive radical democratic movements in the United States took shape and were extremely strong. The Farmers' Alliance, incidentally, which began in Texas. This is not today. Farmers Alliance was then spread throughout the country. Remember, it was an agricultural country then, so huge organization. You take a look at its goals and actions, they were pretty radical. They wanted to get rid of the Eastern bankers who were strangling them. They wanted to be able to have cooperative marketing, cooperative banks, run things by themselves. Massive movement. They tried to unite with the Knights of Labor, which was a huge labor movement, also calling for, workers' ownership of the factories in which they worked and all sorts of ideas which now are considered outlandish. Okay, they were crushed by force, but it was a huge movement. This is a deep part
I'm going
of
to give
American
both of you
history.
guys a chance for a last word as we get towards 7, so you can be thinking about that. I want to open it up, but I think the answer to your question is, you won't like this. You are Schlesingerian, and you think it's going to be about now that we're going to have a swing of the pendulum again.
No, I don't. I think it's constant. There's a constant battle going on.
Okay.
It's called
it's a dialectic, yes.
It's called class struggle. There's a constant battle going on between poor and oppressed people who are seeking their rights. And it can be pretty wealthy people, like, say, middle-class women, but are oppressed and seeking their rights, and those who want to keep them in their place. It's simple as that.
And just to remind you, what Marx did was to turn Hegel on his head. But then you have to go read. So let's open it up, and we'd like people to just come up to the 2 mics, and the rules are be succinct, and the question should have to do with what we talked about. If you want to know about the status of traces in linguistic theory, that's for another day.
Hi, my name is Ben Bolger, and of course, Paulo Freire was writing in the developing country, but if we think about it in the developed sense, it strikes me that when he talks about reading the word and reading the world is very important to our context as well. And what I'm wondering is why don't we have a dedicated curriculum, either in K through 12 or at the university level, for critical literacy? So often we focus on content, mastering one subject or another, but rarely in either K through 12 or college do we actually have a course dedicated on critical literacy skills. And it seems like that would be an important preface to the learning process. So I'm wondering if Professor Chomsky or anyone else would care to comment on the need to introduce a Freirian style of critical literacy to our context.
I think maybe we'll do is let's take 3 or 4 questions. I'll jot down the keywords, and then we'll let them riff. Please. I notice a lot of more people on that side of the room. But go ahead.
I'm Tori Theisenhomer. I'm a doctoral student here at the Ed School. And before this, I was trained at UCLA's teacher education program, where Freire was an integral part of our education. So I wondered if you had insight as to why the Harvard Graduate School of Education doesn't really teach Freire, and if it is fear.
Please.
It's a pleasure to...
Excellent.
Pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for having us all. My question goes related to Freire. You know, he believed in the oppressed taking charge of their education, right? And making it their own example of redemption rather than somebody influencing them. And under that context, we're seeing how in Latin America, for example, in Ecuador, they're building cities of knowledge. In Quechua, Yachay, right? Cities of knowledge where they're trying to empower the people to take advantage of the resources, and they're trying to bring hundreds of PhDs from all over the world to create like the MIT, of Latin America and things like that. And I find that amazing because it hasn't happened, yet. Professor Chomsky, what's your prediction of the impact of schools like this in 100 years, 200 years in Latin America, where we're seeing some sort of consciousness and awareness, regardless of your political beliefs, in these parts of the world?
I didn't quite get that question, did you?
Either, no.
What is your prediction of the impact that these cities of knowledge being built in Latin America?
Cities of knowledge, I guess.
Cities of knowledge.
Every developing country
I
wants
see.
to be the next Silicon
Centers
Valley.
for
or
higher
something.
education, right?
Why don't we take one more question? Amelia, we'll get to you later if there's time, okay?
My name is Heather Pritchard, and I'm a student here at the Graduate School of Education. I recently read a book in which Donato Macedo was interviewing Freire. And Freire said, Donato, don't let them, as in them in the US, import my ideas. They are not made for export. Please make sure they reinvent them. Considering the idea that we here in America may be oppressed and oppressors at the same time, what advice would you offer to us here in this room on how to practically reinvent Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed?
Yeah, nice question, thank you. Let me remind you guys of the 4 questions, then you can each make some comments. Number 1, should we be doing critical literacy in K-12? Number 2, why is there no Freire HGSE? And I'm going to actually take that one. And my answer, I think, will surprise you. Cities of knowledge, that's a buzzword. What do we predict is going to happen there? And then finally, this very interesting quote, which you get from many great thinkers, is they say, don't transport the stuff, reinvent it, if I'm paraphrasing. Bruno, why don't you?
Well, yeah, I'll try to be very short and address each and every question here. Well, another book written by and published by Freire just after this one is called Education for Critical Consciousness. And I think it's an extremely powerful work as well. Now, to answer your question, or no, not to answer, but my answer to your question would be something like, how do you run a country where you have more than, say, 60 or 70% of the people actually able to critically think? It is a very sad way of putting things. Everywhere I went so far, and especially meeting with the people in ministries and etc., policymakers, and everybody says, yeah, we want to raise, the level of education for everyone, etc. But in fact, it is not exactly true. There is a sort of tension here between 2 different aspirations. One is, in order to be competitive at economic level, we need to raise educational standards. But at the same time, we don't want to raise them too much, otherwise it starts to be dangerous for the power of those people who Freire calls the oppressors. So my sense is that there is a lot of hollow incantation there. We want to raise critical consciousness, but at the same time, we make sure that it only affects an elite. Otherwise, it starts to be unmanageable. That is one thing. At the same time, Freire addresses a lot what he calls the dichotomy student-teacher. And he's dreaming of having, students, teachers, and teachers, students. I think it's George Iles who said, whoever ceases to be a student has never been a student. And in fact, well, I know that many of us try to do that when we teach, because actually we teach in order to learn and etc. And our students know so many things that we don't know. And personally, I believe in the collective construction of knowledge. It is not very easy to achieve, but at least in a place like that, I think it is possible, probably easier than in many other places. And the dichotomy student-teacher that Freire is describing as something, negative, and that's part of the banking system and the top-down kind of hierarchical relationship and etc. that has to be revisited, overcome, if not suppressed, is probably something that is very important here. Collective intelligence may be another form of intelligence to be added to Howard's multiple intelligences. The ultimate intelligence is something I cannot believe that many brains are less or less, how do you say, performing or less well performing than just one. And I think Freire, in this sense, it's not political, not really, not primarily political, but I think it's extremely powerful. And he, again, as far as critical consciousness is concerned, one thing that he stresses very much, and people who know me here in the room know that it's one of my Delenda Carthago, kind of, say, he opposes the doxa to the logos, just as Plato did. And say, you are caught in the doxa, you have this beautiful expression in English which says, thinking out of the box. I identify the box with the doxa. In order to think out of the box, the very first thing that you have to do is to identify the box. Know that there is one. See what it is. See what kind of function it performs, what purpose does it serve, and finally be sort of revolting against this and say, I want to be able to think out of the box that is imposed on me by the oppressors, be it the invisible hand or whatever. And I think this is, in my view, one of the still very powerful messages by Freire. He opposes doxa and logos. Logos, as you know, has so many translations. But then we go back to the Gospels, as you said, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, the logos. There we are. This is what we educators are all about, I think.
Sir?
Sorry.
You heard a poem as well as
Yes.
some questions.
I should just picking up on what Bruno said. I mean, there are functioning examples of what you describe. In fact, I happen to have been in one for almost 60 years, and any advanced school of science is pretty much like that. In fact, the sciences would die if there wasn't constant challenge and questioning. Students in a place like MIT are not supposed to copy down what they hear and repeat it in an exam. They're supposed to say, you're wrong, I got a better idea. And if you're standing up in the front of the room, you learn from that. In fact, that's the way it works. When you walk down the hall, you do see, what you commonly see is students working together, in a group, trying to figure something out, contributing. A large part of education, I'm sure you all know this, is just a peer interaction. My son actually went to Harvard, sailed through everything, fun. He told me that he learned more from talking to his fellow students than he learned from in class. The classes were okay, but he just got a lot out of the interchange and interaction with them. And I think that's so. For example, one standard line at a place like MIT actually comes from a world famous physicist who you probably knew, Vicky Weisskopf, great physicist, was famous because he taught freshman courses like a lot of senior faculty do, and he had this. He said that when he was asked in the class at the opening sessions, what are we going to cover this semester? His answer was, it doesn't matter what we cover. It matters what you discover in your own ways. And that's education. And that, incidentally, goes right back to the Enlightenment. I mentioned earlier that there were kind of two counterposed models. One was what Freire calls the banking model, fill the vessel with water. That's one that was condemned. Another image that was used, actually by the founder of the modern university system, Wilhelm von Humboldt, was that education ought to be like laying out a string along which the learner proceeds in his or her own way and learns to inquire and create and maybe push the string around. And so in other words, there's some kind of structure. It's not just do any random thing you want, throw paint at the wall. There's a structure, but you're supposed to explore it, question it, modify it, and basically learn how to create and discover and inquire on your own. Actually, it's not impossible. I mentioned for a moment ago that to Howard that I happened to be in a Deweyite school when I was a kid. At Temple University back 1930s, prehistoric times, the education department had a very strong Deweyite element in it, and they ran an experimental school. And my parents sent it to me. I was there from about age 2 up until age 12. And it was a fantastic experience. I mean, it was pretty much along these lines. There were tests, but they were only to let you know where you stand, you know, something that you ought to know that you don't know, or maybe let the teacher know I'm doing something wrong because things aren't working the way they should. But there was no evaluation of students. And it wasn't necessarily elite. There were students from families like my own who just were very interested in education. But there were other kids who were behavior problems in the public schools. They couldn't handle them, so they sent them here. That was quite a mixture. But there was no evaluation. I literally didn't know I was a good student until I went to an academic high school afterwards. Very horrible experience, academic high school. But until then, you know, I was just a kid in the class. I mean, I knew I had skipped a grade, but all that meant to anybody was I was the smallest kid in the class. You know, nothing else mattered. When my own kids went to school, to what's called a good public school, Lexington Public Schools, and by the time they were in third grade, they were already ranking the students. He's dumb, he's smart, you know, he's this and that. There was nothing like that. And there was a lot of cooperative work, individual work. You followed your own individual interests if you wanted to. Teachers would, you know, help you with resources and things, but encourage that, but also encourage and organize a lot of cooperative work. So I'm convinced that it can be done, you know, experience.
Without our having asked for it, I think Noam Chomsky has actually shared with us his education philosophy, which I have heard about over the years, I think very beautifully. I should mention that MIT, I think over the years, you've been at MIT as long as I've been at Harvard, I think is somewhat more open to confrontation. There's a certain gentility at Harvard, which I think maybe it's less directly confrontational in many ways. I personally, I said I was going to say something about Freire at the Ed School. I don't believe for a minute that there was any censoring. I think you need, and this is why the last question was such an interesting one, I think you need somebody who is who's going to be an enthusiastic presenter and who can translate something which could seem like it's from another part of the world and for adults into something which, as I think came out today, you know, whether you agree with everything said, is much broader than that. It has universal aspects, and it isn't tied particularly to age. And if Nome is right, you know, there's a waxing and waning over time, with the extent to which the raising of consciousness and the flattening of hierarchy is more likely than not. Since we're going past 7, I'd like to give Bruno a chance if he has any last words, and also Nome, and maybe there'll be a stay around a bit more in case people have quick questions. Bruno?
Thank you, Howard. 1 minute. You sort of forced Noam to come back to Hegel because he had read Hegel thanks to the hospital. Freire actually refers to Hegel and to the master-slave dialectics, which he parallels with the teacher-student dichotomy, and of course when it comes to oppressor, oppressed, and etc. But my sense is this: if Freire is still relevant today, it's because, unfortunately, or fortunately maybe for us, because this is also, there's a reason for hope in this, what he's describing is probably as old as mankind and will stay even after us, and etc., which is certainly no reason to just say, well, okay, well, in that case, what does it matter? My sense is that what he says, what Freire tells us today, and again with this sort of religious spirit that he has, that he was influenced by, is that we are spoon-fed a trinity where the Father is the capital, the Messiah is the market, and the Holy Spirit is the free enterprise. And we are spoon-fed this on a daily basis by the media, by everything, remember Noam's manufacturing consent, to agree with this. And that opposite to what someone who died recently said, there is an alternative, and certainly several. So there is a message of hope there. My hope, each time I come here and I meet with these great colleagues here at Harvard, and when I visit Nome regularly, is that I find people who still believe it is possible to make this world a better place. I think that Paulo Freire wanted to do that, and for this reason, he will never be out of date.
I'm happy with that.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming. I have a feeling that you'll remember this evening, thanks to the great conversationalists we had here. And I hope some of you will read Freire and engage in some dialectic in your own mind and some dialogue with others. Then it will be a good use of time. Good.
Very eloquent.
Great.